Chaos and controversy surrounding another fatal South Carolina boating accident involving teenagers. A sit-down interview with South Carolina's top prosecutor, and making sense of another chaotic week in South Carolina politics, which, as always, drives the national political narrative. Welcome to another edition of Your Week in Review. I'm Will Folks, owner and founding editor of FITSNews. Let's dive in. So as we celebrate another Independence Day holiday, another 4th of July here in South Carolina, obviously the Palmetto State known for its lakes, for its rivers, for its coastline. A lot of folks are going to be in boats. A lot of folks probably going to be knocking back a few cold ones. I am joined by Jen Wood, our research director. Jen, obviously this is an integral part of Carolina culture. It's a part of this state, boating, fishing, the outdoors, enjoying the incredible natural resources that are down here in South Carolina and the Southeast in general. It's why so many people are coming here. One of the main reasons so many people are coming here. But there's also a dark side to it, and particularly as we talk about how inevitable incidents that happen on our waterways, how they're dealt with, how they're investigated. Jen, you've done a ton of research into that, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. We're going to talk about sort of the institutional apparatus here and the ability to respond to incidents on South Carolina waterways in a moment. But first, I want to take us back to 2023, Jen, a story that we covered extensively at the time, a story that drew immediate parallels to a famous boat crash case here in South Carolina, the tragic death of 19-year-old Mallory Beach, a lawsuit which followed, which many say led to the unraveling of the Murdoch empire. And Paul Murdoch, the late Paul Murdoch, alleged to be piloting the boat, which crashed into Archers Creek Bridge down there in Beaufort County, wound up costing Mallory Beach her life. That case drew tons of attention. It was the focus of international documentaries. It has sparked a ton of discussion about these issues. But Jen, when we covered this story back in 2023 in Kershaw County, a lot of people drew parallels. And I want you to just walk us through what happened, and we're going to talk about the reason we're talking about it this week. We're going to talk about the latest developments in it. But give us the background of this Wateree River tragedy.
Okay, so this accident happened on May 5th of 2023, so right at the beginning of boating season. 15-year-old Chase Wyatt Newman, who was a rising sophomore, standout golfer at Camden High School, was killed in an evening boating crash on the Wateree River. So the reason why we did this initial report is Chase was seated in the back of a boat that was driven by Zach Cameron, who is the grandson of the Kershaw County coroner, David West. So, there were a lot of questions at the time of the initial report about the response. David West, as we will see in body cam footage that we're going to show in a bit, it was on the scene. I don't believe that the responding officers necessarily knew that he was not there in his official capacity as the coroner. And the reason that I wrote about this story this week, we are 2 years out, is that there is a lawsuit, a civil lawsuit in Kershaw County Court filed by Chase's parents. So Chase's parents allege in this lawsuit that Zach Cameron and the others had allegedly been drinking beer throughout the day, and the alcohol that they had purchased was through a straw purchase, which means they had somebody else buy it for them from a Circle K. So, that is a big part of that lawsuit. But, we are also looking at, the investigation of this accident. There were no criminal charges filed against anybody related to this accident. Nobody was accused of driving under the influence. There was no investigation done at the scene as to whether or not the drivers of the two boats that collided were under the influence. No field sobriety tests, no field test for breath alcohol, no blood test for alcohol. And we're talking about a fatal collision. So, part of what we're talking about is that response. What was it right? But the article that I did this week, just so we're aware, was that the Richland County judge ruled that Circle K where the alcohol was purchased must turn over their internal document surveillance footage and sales records that were related to the incident, which it was rejecting a motion to protect the documents by Circle K. So that is the reason I did this story. But as we're doing this story, we're kind of looking back at the initial response to the accident and, what needs to be changed to improve that, because we also have another story that we covered relating to an accident of another young man, 19-year-old Jaden Phillips, that this brings back a lot of, in addition to the ties to Mallory Beach, this really had a lot of ties to that 2020 crash that took the life of Jaden Phillips.
That crash actually has prompted legislation. Jermaine Johnson, one of the candidates for governor here in South Carolina, has proposed a bill, Jen, which you're going to talk about here in a moment, which would standardize these investigations. But Jen, real quick, before you go on the Jaden's
Yeah.
law, I want to back up real quick. You had mentioned that the coroner West there in Kershaw County was not on the scene in an official capacity. However, he did provide information to members of the media about what happened and neglected to mention at the time that, oh, yeah, by the way, it was my grandson driving the boat. We're going to return to that when we get into the body cam, but I just wanted to bring that up. Jen, go back into the crash involving Jaden and the legislation that was proposed in its aftermath.
Okay, so Jaden Phillips, 19-year-old Jaden Phillips, he died on May 16th, 2020, on the Congaree River, which was right on the border of Richland and Calhoun counties. So he was out with a group, including his father, boating, celebrating his birthday. The driver of the boat, Irvin Franklin is how he's referred to, Eckroat. He was allegedly intoxicated per witness accounts and visibly drinking in video evidence that was submitted after the accident. So they're driving, through the river. They cut the edge, I think is what they call it, and
Cutting the river.
yeah, cutting the river, which means take it close to the bank, and a tree branch allegedly hit Jaden's head, and this resulted in fatal injuries. We in this incident we had a delayed 911 call. There were emergency response failures. The ambulance was delayed. There was questions about what jurisdiction it was in, since it was on the county line. And then once they got there, I mean, these accidents, they're fatal accidents, and the response, they're in and out in like 30 minutes to an hour. The authorities in that investigation, so when a boating accident happens, the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources takes over jurisdiction of the investigation. SCDNR in Jaden's case was not notified until days after the accident. So a coroner's inquest, the death was ultimately ruled accidental. They did a coroner's inquest looking at the cause and manner of death again. And that once again came back as accidental. But this law, what they're hoping to do is mandate that 911 dispatchers ask if boating accidents involve injury, which would immediately prompt them to notify the DNR so that they respond. There's no delay in response time for the DNR. The dispatchers are required to provide exact physical and GPS coordinates for boat landings, require clear language at boat landings, because apparently the signage at this accident was not clear. And then in addition, it would require on-water accident response to include immediate incident reports, scene investigations, and do blood alcohol content testing for operators, and involve authorities if death or unconsciousness does occur.
Zeroing back in on personal responsibility, there's sort of a permissiveness. And, we go out on boats all the time down here with people. It's a little easier piloting a boat, my experience anyway, for folks I've been around, to get a little more, you're out in the sun, it's a little hotter, you got to think about that. But also, it's a little easier on a boat. I don't have cops over my shoulder. There's no speed traps. I can knock down another beer or two. It's not going to hurt me. Whereas on the road, and again, there's a lot of lack of responsibility there in South Carolina too, as cases we covered. But the boat, it seems that people are a little more willing to take that risk when it comes to alcohol. I mean, is that your sense, Jen, or?
Yeah, I mean, so I grew up in Michigan where our local departments actually they got funding from the state to patrol the waterways. So, the DNRs, there's only so many of them. And we would go out every summer. There would be increased presence on the waterways of patrol boats. And we would stop people. We would do, boater safety checks. And in the process of doing those boater safety checks, you could check to, get a sense of whether or not the driver was drinking. I do think that that was, a preventative measure. I think they knew we were out there. They all, it was big community policing effort, but I do think that that did limit, and prevent some people from drinking on the water. And we
So,
did do arrest for driving under the influence.
so we've got a climate that kind of encourages a little more risk ahead of incidents, and then after incidents, we've got a climate which lacks accountability, lacks standardization. None of this is leading us toward justice for folks whose family members lose their lives, is it, Jen?
No, no. And, I do think, watching this scene response, you don't often, because body camera footage is not subject to FOIA under South Carolina, you don't often get the opportunity to view this stuff. And looking at the response to Chase's accident, you see just how chaotic these scenes are and just how difficult. I mean, you don't have, well, this person crossed into my lane, or I hit a tree. There's no lanes of traffic on the waterway.
Fewer cameras.
Right. And you can tell from how they are describing this. I listened to these descriptions of what happened from these young adults, and it was hard to tell what happened. You don't see damage on the boat. How is this child dead? How is he laying in an ambulance right there with his mother screaming in the background, dead, based on what you're telling me? It's very confusing.
And Chase he was
15.
pronounced dead on the
Yeah.
scene.
15 years old, pronounced dead on the scene.
Well, Jen, let's take a look at some of this footage. I mean, this is raw. This is hard to watch, but Jen, let's take a look.
He's like 15.
So, y'all hit something? Y'all hit a stump or something?
No,
These two boats went like that. One of the boats' valves hit him, I think. I think that's what hit him. I mean, it went so fast we don't know. And he was knocked clear out and bleeding from everywhere.
He was bleeding from his head. I was holding his head.
It just happened so fast, we don't really know what happened exactly.
All of
Yes,
y'all
sir.
were on the
Yes.
boat?
And-
Yes, sir.
Yes,
And
sir.
her up there.
It was me, him, and her
Okay.
on the express right there.
Us
Wait,
four.
you, who, and who? Me, him, and her were on the boat right
And then
there.
I'm guessing y'all three were
Yeah,
on the
and
boat
him.
along with
Yeah.
them.
Yes,
sir.
sir.
It's confusing. Like, who's on what boat, who is sitting where. I mean, there's no, people are sitting on floors. It's a confusing scene, and doesn't get any less confusing as it goes on. We do have FOIA requests in for the reports from DNR, Kershaw County, and any other investigating entities, just to get a sense of what the official narrative said. But that is probably, I think that's about 3 minutes after they loaded Chase onto the ambulance. The ambulance never leaves the boat launch, because I think they realized that he was no longer alive. So yeah, I mean, it's a chaotic scene, and then we get into, the Chase's mother, Melissa Branham, arrives on the scene, and the kids are, just it's heartbreaking. But the really interesting thing is when the DNR officer arrives on the scene, he very clearly is aware that Zach Cameron is David West's grandson and notifies the officer. Do you want to take a look at that?
Yeah, let's take a look at
Okay.
that clip. Absolutely.
What's up, Lord?
How bad is it?
He's in the back of the ambulance. He's bleeding out the mouth and the head. You already know the update, right?
Well, I know he's dead.
Yeah, he's 10-7.
That
No, these are. God damn. I already know, or I know, that his mom and everybody's down there. These are all of the witnesses,
okay.
and we're doing a report on it too.
Perfect.
So if you need my case, and I mean, hell, you got my number. You can give me a call or shoot me a
Maybe that
text.
is right. That's David's grandson,
David, dude.
West.
Really?
That's William's nephew.
Shit.
Yeah. Him and I said we're going to do this for him.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
He's
if
not. He's not the one who did it.
No, it's some Chase boy named, or some boy named Chase. He's 15 years old.
So he, clearly the officer had no clue. And then once he found out, very interesting response. Then the officer, what we're going to see now is the officer had walked back down to the scene, and you're going to see where the coroner, David West, is on the scene talking to witnesses. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that next.
I think that's mom in the purple or blue shirt sitting down.
Okay, so
What are you saying there?
All right, so Jen, that is Coroner West in that video speaking with witnesses.
Right, on the scene. So, being on the scene as, a grandparent, guardian, totally different. But, from what sources have told us, the officers were under the understanding that he was on the scene in his official capacity as coroner. Should have been nowhere near those boats.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about what we've seen, but also let's talk a little bit about what we have not seen in any of this footage, Jen. It's discussion about alcohol. It's investigation about alcohol. And clearly we now know alcohol was a factor in this case.
Correct.
And
yeah, there's no quite like, were any of you drinking? Was there alcohol on the boat? There's no indication that the officers were looking, at their eye movements, their for any indications of alcohol consumption prior to the accident. And from what we've been told, that it didn't even come out that there was drinking until after the accident.
Well, after. That's correct. And let's, just to be clear here, we're not accusing anyone of corruption. We're not accusing anyone of not doing their jobs or exerting undue influence over a scene. At this point, we're simply looking at some questionable circumstances here in the aftermath of this tragedy that you would think would have raised red flags, which would have prompted sorts of investigations that didn't happen here. And so I guess the question, obviously, the Attorney General reviewed this case. There were no charges filed, as you mentioned at the outset. But Jen, had we known everything then that we knew later, that would have completely changed the complexion of this investigation. Maybe if you didn't have a powerful local elected official related to one of the people principally involved showing up on the scene, maybe that would have directed it differently. But all these things, now you look back on it, while we're not saying anything corrupt took place, it's easy to see how people could think that it did. It's easy to see how this has created yet another situation where we're dealing with a tragic boat case, which claims the life of a South Carolina teenager with limited accountability. And, I got to tell you, Jen, listening to his mom in those videos, not only what she had to deal with then, but now, because of all these things that we're talking about, the lack of answers, the lack of accountability, that's got to be even harder on her to go back now to know that all of this happened, and yet justice is elusive.
Right. And I mean, I think it's not whether, it's not whether or not what it comes down to is we have to do better. Like responding to scenes, doing these investigations, holding people accountable, we have to do better. And if putting some systems and laws into place to make sure that we do better is the answer, then let's do that.
But Jen, I just want to say this holiday, future holidays, people need to think about the choices they are making, whether it's on the water, whether it's on the road. Think about the consequences of the decisions that you make. And listening to that footage, the screams of this young man's mother, Chase's mother, think about the decisions you make and the consequences. But Jen, as we're discussing here, that individual accountability is always going to be elusive if we don't have the right processes in place to respond to these incidents. And so just amazing work on your part, digging into not only the specifics of what happened in this case, but that greater fallout, the push for legislation to try and standardize these practices so that we end up in situations where people have more options for justice. Jen, before you go, I want to switch gears here real quick. I want to talk a little bit about a case that is very familiar to our audience. We were talking about it a moment ago as it related to the boat crash which launched that Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption saga. But Jen, there's some new developments in the Murdoch case. You've been working on a big story that's going to drop early next week related to some text messages involving Alex Murdoch. Walk us through what you're working on, Jen.
All right. So, yeah, this should be out at some point next week. And what we did was we took a look at what the state did not include in that 88-page timeline that they presented during the trial of Alex Murdoch. That timeline was extensive, but what to me was more interesting is what wasn't included. And we did get a hold of all of Alex Murdoch's, cell records and took a look at his text messages in the days before and after the murder of Maggie and Paul Murdoch. And what we saw, I think, is it's interesting in the context of the questions that people still have, despite the fact that he was convicted, those loose ends that we've been talking about regarding Alex Murdoch's drug use and potential involvement in drugs. And
don't give too much away here, Jim. We won't be able to come back Monday and read this story. But
the reason that I dug into these text messages again is it was after the Clucci hearing. SLED agent David Owen was questioned extensively by Michael Clucci's defense, and David Owen,
of course, the lead SLED agent on the Murdoch investigation.
Right. And in his questioning that, that indictment, that murder indictment was quashed because of exculpatory evidence that was not presented to the defense and the grand jury for the initial indictment. But in his testimony, he was questioned about text messages that he put into discovery. And he said, you put the stuff in the report that's important to you. And that made me think about these text messages again and looking at them again. And I think it's interesting what wasn't included. Now, we're not saying that they were withheld from the defense. We're not saying that there was any exculpatory evidence. And I don't know why the defense didn't bring these up during the trial as well. But these messages, I think people are going to be surprised by them.
Well, that report dropping early next week. So for those of you who are following the Murdoch murders, crime, and corruption saga, which, by the way, heating back up, folks don't realize this, but this case is going to be heard on appeal later this year. We're still waiting on the state to file its response to Alex Murdoch's appeal, which is an incredibly compelling document. We've all heard about the jury tampering, but Jen, you detailed there's some other very credible components of that appeal. And I actually had the opportunity this week to sit down with the top prosecutor in the state of South Carolina, Attorney General Alan Wilson. And I put it to him directly, whether he thinks that case is coming back. Here's that excerpt.
First off, I don't ever want to presume to know how a court is going to respond to an otherwise credible appeal. We believe we did a credible job prosecuting that case. We believe that we have a record that we did a very good job of protecting. And I know that part of due process in the criminal justice system is that people need to avail themselves of every option to appeal a conviction. And Alec Murdoch has all of these constitutional rights, and his legal team is going to avail themselves, and they're going to fight vigorously on his behalf. They're going to advocate for him, and you call it a credible appeal, but I believe that we have done a credible job of securing this conviction. Now, what?
Oh, yeah, no, and no one. The basis of the appeal that I see has nothing to do with the job you guys did. It's the tampering on the part of another party.
It's the other stuff, and I understand that. Look, I'm not going to predict what the court's going to do. What I'm going to say is that we stand by our product. I am hopeful that this conviction will stand. And look, if by some stretch of the imagination the unthinkable happens, look, we're all professionals. We're going to go back and we're going to do our jobs. And anytime you have hindsight, and if you have to retry any case, not just this case, any case, anytime you have hindsight, that's always valuable. I mean, it's a learned lesson, and how you approach something when you've already done it once before, you're obviously going to be better at it. But you know what? So will the other side. We've all seen this movie before. But look, I could not be more proud of the men and women in our office. I mean, I always tell people personnel is policy. You pick the right personnel, you're going to get the right outcomes. And I picked the team. The team did what they were asked to do. I supported the team. I sat in court with the team because I wanted them to know that no matter what happens, I'm going over the cliff with you. If this thing goes south and if this thing goes great, I get to go around the state and brag about you. So right now I'm keeping my word. I want to brag about our team. We've got some amazing men and women committed to justice, committed to being a voice for people who have no voice, and who are always going to stand in the gap and do everything they can to promote justice. And I just want to thank them. It's been, like, being the Attorney General of an office with so many amazing people has been truly the honor of a lifetime, Will. And being able to be in that courtroom for those 6 weeks 2 years ago was an amazing experience for me, and I'll never forget it. And honestly, to be able to help them to take the case's closing rebuttal witness and to just cinch it up for them, to do my part to support them, to just be to be a team member, not their leader, but their teammate, was an honor for me, and it reminded me of how much I love being a prosecutor.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was actually in Camden, South Carolina a few months ago on a panel with 3 of the members of your team, Savannah, Don, and Johnny, and told that crowd there, and would certainly tell our audience they did an amazing job. Your team really did knock it out of the park, and if you do have to run it back, it will certainly be no fault of the Attorney General's office. Although I would say I think you're going to have to run it back, man. I'm no expert, no judge, but I think you're going to have to run that one back. But hey, like you said, hindsight's 20/20 for both sides.
Well, and I want to remind people, Mr. Murdoch did plead guilty to all the financial crimes, and I think there's a 27-year sentence hanging out over there. So, we're going to have time to try this case.
Absolutely.
If that happens.
All right, so Jen, obviously he's very confident, just as Dick Harpootlian is confident that Alec Murdoch will get a new trial. Where are you on this question right now, Jen, as far as the likelihood of Alec Murdoch receiving a new trial?
I personally think he's going to get a new trial. I think
100%.
he should get it. Yeah, whether or not, I don't know if the state Supreme Court's going to give him the new trial or if it's going to come at the federal level, but I think he's going to get a new trial. I do.
And we're in South Carolina where everyone just wants this story to go away. The lawyers, the judges, they just want this to go away.
Buddy, I want it to go away too.
No, hey.
It's exhausting, but
there's that. There's that pesky 6th Amendment.
Yeah, I mean,
what do you do about that?
You cannot. That has to be a consideration. Yeah. I think he's where he should be. I keep saying that over and over again. But, as we look at this appeal, the state's response is due early August, and the state has filed within the past week a notification to the court that they will be meeting that response deadline this time, because they've had 2 extensions.
Only a year later.
Yeah. So they will meet that deadline. So we will have, additional reports. But as we get into that appeal, we are going to take a closer look at this story and start looking at these things that everybody still has questions about. So, you can look for further deep dives from the FITSNews crew in our new series, Murdoch Justice Revisited. I'm excited about it. We've got a lot of interesting things planned in this text message. Text message reveal is just the first story of many.
Absolutely. Jen, your work on this has been phenomenal. And we are now going to head into a segment where we dive into more content and more context from that interview with Attorney General Alan Wilson. So obviously a very extensive conversation we had with South Carolina's top prosecutor, Alan Wilson, not just about that high-profile criminal case, the Murdoch case, but we also spent much of our discussion with him focused forward on his candidacy for governor of South Carolina. Announced just last month, he's one of the front runners in that race. Our Dylan Nolan, in fact, was at his announcement in Lexington, South Carolina last month, saw his speech there. We're going to talk about that in a moment, but I did want to focus in on one area of that interview, which again, dropping next week. You can watch the full thing next week where he talks about why he's running, what motivated him, what he plans to do if elected. But one of the areas I focused on and pushed him on a little bit was his support for President Donald Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, something we're going to talk about here in just a minute as it dominated the national news cycle. But I asked him about whether one of his soon-to-be rivals in the governor's race, Ralph Norman, was right about his initial criticism of that bill. Here's that exchange with the Attorney General. It's $3.4 trillion in new deficit spending on top of the existing deficit spending. We've got a $5 trillion increase in the debt ceiling. As a fiscal conservative, isn't Congressman Norman right that this bill is not the way to go when it comes to reining in that deficit spending?
First off, let me say this. Congressman Norman's a friend of mine. I think he's a good man. My family and his family have been friends for many years, and we might have a policy disagreement on this particular issue, but I don't in any way mean this doesn't mean as an attack on him. It's meant to illustrate this one point, Will. You and I have had conversations in the past, and you've heard me say this many times. Two things can be true at once, right? And this is one of those cases where two things can be true at once. There is a bill with a lot of warts on it, things that I don't like, things that I think are harmful to our debt. But there are things in this bill that, if they're not implemented, could be devastating for the small business owners, for the for American families, for South Carolina families. And there are provisions.
Examples.
The expiration of the tax cuts from 2017, by way of example. Also, the resources that are being diverted to the border, to border security, which to me is not only law enforcement and public safety, it's national security. What the president has done in the first 100 days of his administration is a miracle. I was in the Yuma sector of Arizona about a month or so ago, and I was meeting with Border Patrol, and they were telling us that in May of 2023, they were averaging, in that 1 mile section of the border, just that 1 mile section, they were averaging 1,500 illegal crossings a day. Since President Trump took office in May of 2025, they are averaging 4 illegal crossings per day.
Well, we were there in May of 2023. We took a trip to that very sector.
And you've seen it.
Yeah.
Of course, I've been to the El Paso sector as well, and it was the same thing there. Border security is so important. It is not only public safety, it is national security. Will, all of the drug trafficking cases that we have, and we have a lot, they're all originating with Mexican drug cartels coordinating with these violent gangs, these extremist gangs that are now, last summer they weren't here, but Tren de Aragua wasn't here last summer. They're here now. MS-13's been here for years. And it's not just the Mexican cartels and the gangs from south of the border, but it's a lot of these other organizations. You've got Chinese nationals crossing the border. You've got proxy organizations that are affiliated with Iran. You have all these Middle Eastern countries, and I'm not singling them out because they're Middle Eastern. I'm singling them out because they're terrorist organizations. They're coming over in that migratory wave over the Biden administration into the interior of the United States. And now the president has done a great job of plugging the holes in the boat that is America, but now we have to bail out the water. And a lot of the funding in this bill goes to those national security and public safety priorities that I personally have. I 100% agree with Congressman Norman when it comes to, and anyone else who wants to talk about the growth of the debt that this bill could do. But I have learned something. when you're in leadership positions, your choices are not always binary, meaning you have a good choice and you have a bad choice. Sometimes you have a bad choice and a worse choice. And for me, the worst choice is not passing it. I would agree with him. I would agree with you as a fiscal hawk, as someone who wants to confine spending. But this is a bill that if it's not passed, I believe the harms of not passing it outweigh the harms of passing it. We can always come back when we have a better majority and we can address it. But right now, having those tax cuts expire, having those protections on the border and the security that goes with it expire could be very, very dangerous. And you're talking to a guy who deals in the world where I'm dealing with cartels and I'm dealing with gangs and I'm dealing with drug trafficking and human trafficking and the hundreds of millions of dollars in fentanyl that's been piped into our country and our state. It is scary. It terrifies me. And it's what keeps me up at night. And we got to do something about it.
We've been talking about this a little bit. Obviously was giving the Attorney General a little bit of grief on that position and praising Ralph Norman. It turns out I may have spoken a little too quickly because shortly after slamming this bill as a non-starter of saying that it will contribute to the bankruptcy of the country, Ralph Norman voted for it.
Not surprising.
Why not?
What's the alternative?
For him politically or for the country?
For the country.
Okay.
Seriously, I mean, the expiration of the 2017 tax cuts would mean economic bedlam.
Okay.
So they at least had to pass a bill which got that done. Now you look at the Republican control of the House and the Senate, both are sitting on knife's edges. That means that this is their one opportunity. Now, whether you want to brand it as beautiful or not, this is, in all likelihood, what they're going to get through. This is Trump's legislative agenda.
Well, Dylan, let's talk about this because, again, we see people post on social media reflexively for it, against it, not always fully aware of what's in it. But let's break down the good, the bad, the ugly of this thing. Obviously, makes permanent Trump's 2017 tax cuts, which included individual income tax cuts, included the higher exemption for the death tax, all manner of pro-manufacturing tax relief in that bill. In fact, the Senate version of it in that area was actually better, made some of those things permanent, whereas the House, it was just an incremental. And estimates are that this will add roughly 1.1% GDP growth to the economy and will actually boost from that about $900 billion in new revenue from economic growth, this stimulative effect of tax relief that we talk about. But, and there's some key buts here, another $500 billion in new subsidies, pork, preserving a big chunk of the Green New Deal from the Biden administration. Those things are, again, what I would feel would be a non-starter if I'm casting a vote for it in the U.S. House. But I want to talk, before we get into the politics of it and the efficacy of passing this all in one thing, let's think about the numbers on this bill. $3.4 trillion in new deficit spending, on top of the current deficit spending, which, by the way, is approaching 130% of GDP. Okay, we're talking about a $36 trillion national debt. The interest payments on that are going to be $1 trillion next year. By the time the decade's over, they're going to be $1.8 trillion a year. A year, $323,000 of debt per taxpayer. This bill does nothing to reduce that. In fact, puts it on steroids. And by the way, kicks the can down the road by raising the debt ceiling another $5 trillion. But you tell me we had to do this?
Well, let's start with the 2017 tax cut extension. They certainly had to continue that because at this point in time, America's economy has this baked in. If you look at the stock market, you were talking about how your stock portfolio is doing very well this week. And that's because they had baked in these tax cuts continuing because it would have been political suicide to not continue them and pretty insane. So they had to get that part done. The question is, what else are they going to do? That's where you start getting into the fringes here. But I would say that they gave voters what they wanted. Now, we're in a country where everybody wants things, whether it's states want these projects, so they're going to have their representatives come in and argue, even if it's a green energy project, they want their money. You've got people who are on these programs, and I feel for these people. There's members of my family on these programs. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. These are things which cost absurd amounts of money. And as you point out, the interest on the debt that we've already taken out, that's not even getting us anything at this point, but that takes an absurd amount of the budget every year. And then there's military spending, which is the other big chunk. Obviously, there's other things we spend money on, but this covers the majority of them. Trump did not run on cutting any of these things because he would have gotten killed. He would have gotten killed electorally. He's giving the voters what he told them he got. He said, I'm not going to touch your Medicare, your Medicaid, your Social Security. He said he's not going after these social programs. He did say he's going to fix the deficit. He also said he was going to solve the war in Ukraine in one day. Both of those patently false. Right. But also, does anybody with a realistic understanding of what's going on in D.C. really expect them to go and cut spending when they have razor-thin margins and would get absolutely massacred in the midterms if they did that? I mean, I know people like to grandstand about it. You look at what Ralph did. He grandstanded for a day. You know, we wrote a big article praising him. And then what does he go? He does and votes for the debt. But at the end of the day, this is more so, you can pin it on Trump. You can pin it on the members of the Congress. It's a problem with us, the American people, the people who vote them into office to continue profligately spending. And you look at the inflation that we saw already. I mean, this year, the dollar's lost 10%. I think it's actually up to 11% now of its value. We are going to pay for this in a very literal sense. And maybe at that point in time, we will vote for austerity. But right now, where the American people are voting for austerity, I mean, that would quickly return this chamber, which is already a couple of, Republicans dying in a bus crash away from being democratically controlled in both the House and the Senate. That is now democratically controlled, and spending will, you're certainly not going to have any argument for any spending cutting under that regime. So politics is the art of the possible. Do I like that I'm going to be screwed by inflation and that my children are going to be screwed by inflation? No, but also I like our system of government, and this is what our voters are telling the politicians they want. We're telling them to spend more money. So I just don't know what the alternative is.
Well, there were a few alternatives I saw in this process. Let's start with the $500 billion in the new subsidies. Let's talk about the Green New Deal subsidies that were preserved that could have been eliminated. Let's also talk about what the House did. And again, we were talking earlier about how the Senate version did some things on permanent tax relief that were better than what the House did, particularly on the business side, which is a good thing, I think most people would argue. But where the House, I think, did a good thing that the Senate screwed up was this fiscal framework, whereby any tax cut over $2.5 trillion, House said you got to pay for it. You've got to offset it. And so that would have been another $500 billion. So you start adding these things up, $500 billion in cuts, $500 billion getting rid of these subsidies, $500 billion crushing that Green New Deal. All of a sudden, you're dealing in real money, Dylan. And so kind of see where you're coming from. But my point is, we did elect these people. Some of these people did come up with some of these solutions, some of which passed both chambers, good things that passed both chambers. Yet what they agreed on was sort of took the worst of all bills.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to fight you and say that this bill is what I would want.
Yeah.
But I also think that if you talk to a lot of the people who put these representatives in, you start talking to them about taking money out of their pocket, that's a non-starter.
Well, let me ask you this question, and bringing this back to the South Carolina political lens, and I look forward to seeing how this is going to unfold in the upcoming governor's race. We talked about Ralph Norman and his vote. Funny thing is, who's going to criticize him on that? Because all of the people he's running against supported this thing. Nancy Mace voted for it. Alan Wilson cheerleading for it. Pam Yvette cheerleading for it.
Well, and he's between a rock and a hard place. And, I was tough on him, but the reality is I think he's exerting the leverage that he could because he was sitting on the Ways and Means Committee where he could actually vote to slow this thing down. So by opposing this bill, that's the only, if he votes yes, he has no leverage, right?
Right.
So the only thing that he can do to try to get more fiscal conservatism is to slow it and pump the brakes. But at the end of the day, I think for the reasons I just outlined, he knew this thing was going to pass. Everybody knew this thing was going to pass. If you look at a betting market of whether this thing was going to pass, it would be absurdly high. Now the fine details, I think that's why you hold something up in committee. Yeah. But yes, he's lost his leverage to campaign as the fiscal conservative here.
Yeah, Ralph Norman, obviously the candidate who will be pushed by the Freedom Caucus. He is already receiving endorsements even before he jumps into the race. We're talking to ton of members of that Freedom Caucus who tell us they are Team Ralph. Talked to a lot of other conservative activists here in South Carolina who have told us that they are supportive of Ralph Norman's gubernatorial bid, which he is expected to announce later this month. Dylan, when we looked at this field at the beginning, it was really a lot of talk about Wilson Mace, some talk about Yvette for months. Ralph Norman, that conversation was kind of an afterthought, but as he has made his intentions clear, as he has, again, begun to align with that Freedom Caucus movement, which is really where the GOP voters are. I mean, that's where they are in terms of their ideology right now. You see him as a viable contender in this contest?
Oh yeah, he should be taken very seriously. I mean, he's a skilled politician, and as you say, he speaks to the primary voters.
Yeah.
So, especially if you're a guy like Alan Wilson, I think that they are competing kind of for a similar type of voter. If I'm Alan, would be very much so keeping my eye on that campaign and tracking closely what Ralph was doing, so I can contrast myself and try to make sure that I'm not having that kind of voter slip to Ralph.
Yeah. Well, we talk a lot on this show about how South Carolina politics impacts the national election. It impacts national issues, drives the national discussion when it comes to these particularly pivotal presidential primaries. But we're seeing a lot of this starting to manifest itself in other areas, Dylan. And I want to talk real quickly this week about U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, a name very familiar across the country. He is basically the senator from the military-industrial complex. And certainly he represents, in name, the citizens of South Carolina. But if you look at his advocacy, his votes, he's basically repping the military-industrial complex and the nations that they're pouring weaponry into. But let's talk a little bit about this guy. He has skated in terms of the Republican primary here in South Carolina from the moment he ran for Senate. He was unopposed in the GOP primary when he first ran for Senate way back in 2002, has not faced any credible opposition throughout the past nearly quarter century. That's changing. That's changing. This year, Graham now opposed by, on the record, at least one credible candidate, former South Carolina Lieutenant Governor Andre Bauer, who made his announcement. It was first reported here on FITSNews, then confirmed by Meg Kennard of the Associated Press. Made his announcement official this week, and boy, did he get lit up like a piñata the second he stepped in the ring, Dylan.
Oh yeah, I mean Lindsey Graham's got more money than Scrooge McDuck. He will machine gun it at any serious rival. He's been holding this seat since 2002, and this is the first time he's faced somebody with name recognition and with money. And yeah, I mean immediately they were digging up dirt. You had Andre Bauer mugging with Kamala Harris. I mean that's the kind of stuff, and there's going to be more dirt to come. There's going to be more and more dirt to come, but. That's the kind of stuff that you're going to see. And I mean, if you're a guy like Andre Bauer, that's an unforced error. But I think Lindsey has so little support within the Republican primary electorate. I mean, he was running against absolute nobodies who had no money, and he only scored, 67% of the Republican electorate? That might sound commanding, but it's not.
Yeah, but let's talk about you wrote an article this week on FITSNews assessing the impact of the hiring of Chris LaCivita, obviously one of Donald Trump's key
Donald Trump's two campaign managers from the 2024 campaign. Him and Susie Wiles ran Donald Trump's successful campaign, but he has a history of running since the early 2000s, dozens of successful Republican campaigns at the state level, as well as for U.S. House and Senate seats.
And this is a message, though. Is this Trump sending a message that he wants Graham? I mean, obviously he's endorsed Lindsey Graham, but there's been a ton of speculation about, well, is it going to be, a full muscular push to get Graham across the finish line, or is it just the, hey, I'm patting you on the back and giving you my seal of approval? LaCivita would seem to indicate it's the former.
Obviously, Trump is notoriously mercurial, and it's hard to get a read on exactly what's going on with him, but sending one of your top lieutenants to do battle on behalf of Graham certainly sends a message.
But I want to twist this around a little bit. We've been talking about what sort of Donald Trump endorsement of Lindsey Graham will it end up being? Will it end up being this full-throated thing? But what if we looked at it from a different lens? You've seen the videos of Graham getting booed repeatedly
in Pickens, South Carolina,
and lustily by South Carolina Republican primary voters. I guess my question is this: whether it is a pat on the back or a full-on push, will it matter? And also, does Donald Trump run the risk by being more aggressively supportive of Lindsey Graham of hurting his own standing here?
Donald Trump's never going to be on a ballot again. I think that's a limited consideration.
Really? Has he said that? Or you think he's just trolling people?
He's trolling. He's definitely trolling. I mean, look at how old he's going to be. But in my opinion, who knows? It's Trump. You never know.
Yeah.
But he doesn't have a stellar track record when it comes to endorsing Senate candidates. I mean, talk about Senator Oz. Oh wait. Talk about Senator Walker. Oh wait.
And even in primary races in Alabama, I believe it was, got shot down.
Yes, Trump endorsed candidates are fallible.
Nancy Mace, in fact, beat a Trump-backed candidate here in South Carolina. So it is a significant endorsement, but it is not the be-all, end-all. And Lindsey Graham, with his numbers...
South Carolina Republican voters love Donald Trump, and a lot of them hate Lindsey Graham. And I think that a lot of those people they were literally at the Trump rally booing Lindsey Graham. They have no problem holding those two ideas in their head. So are one of those people who were, one step away from throwing rotten tomatoes up at Graham when he took the stage, who clearly love Trump because that's why they were there, are those people going to take a Trump endorsement of Graham seriously? Having talked to dozens of people like that myself, no. I don't think they're going to care very much.
And obviously you can hit a lot of potential Graham opponents for being not sufficiently loyal to Trump, but you cannot hit Andre Bauer with that. I mean, this is a guy, Trump nominated him for an ambassadorship. He was one of the folks on stage with Trump when he announced his 2024 relaunch. And that's sort of been Trump's litmus test. Hey, those people on the stage, I've got them. I'm going to protect them. But clearly now he's got two of them at odds at each other. He's going to have to make a decision on the emphasis there. But Bauer is not someone that you can just paint with this brush. I mean, he's somebody he's a Trump backer through and through. His announcement was basically a Trump campaign video.
Yeah. And, Trump supporter or not, I think his greatest strength is he's not Lindsey Graham.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, this is an election that's going to have big national implications. There's going to be national money flowing in like you wouldn't believe. And not just that military industrial complex money for Lindsey Graham. I think we're going to see a ton of money flowing in for whoever emerges as the top Republican rival to him. And you did another story this week, Dylan. There's another name that's been tossed in the ring. Tell us a little bit about that.
So we all remember Project 2025. I think it started as famous, migrated to infamous as Democrats Joe Biden and Kamala Harris successfully weaponized what is basically the blueprint for this second Trump administration prior to the election, pulling some of the more extreme passages and blasting them in Trump's face. But Paul Dance is the architect, the man who was behind this at the Heritage Foundation. He was a big league litigator in New York who, in the first Trump administration, kind of was looking for a job the whole time. He eventually ended up on the HR side, the hiring side. And after the first Trump administration, he was looking to put together a system so that they can more efficiently put together the folks who were going to work in the second Trump administration. And he put together basically like an internal LinkedIn-style system for Republican political operatives where he eventually amassed like a 20,000 person database, which is why you look at the efficacy of the first 100 days of the first Trump administration versus the second. They put together...
This is a guy who helped create
this is the guy who did all the brain work that led to this. They put together an actual plan, much like what they handed to Ronald Reagan. This is the same Heritage Foundation that gave Ronald Reagan his agenda that, folks still love to this day.
And this guy's coming to South Carolina and thinking about running against Graham as well?
Yes, but the hairy bit is that basically he had a messy breakup with Trump. Things went on the skids between, actually, La Savita and himself around the time that Project 2025 became political no-no. Susie Wiles, La Savita decided to distance themselves from the project, which they saw as pulling negative publicity onto Trump. Trump acted like he had no clue what it was, which I always thought was just absolutely hilarious because it was written by a bunch of his former staffers and people who are now, currently in his administration. But, that's politics for you.
Yeah.
But this guy, he's been making phone calls, so we hear. He has money, so we hear. And it would be interesting to see if another person that is, serious contender hops in this race. The fact that he's considering it is indicative of Lindsey's weakness.
Absolutely. And it's also indicative of the nationalization of this race. We always talk about how races in South Carolina sometimes get nationalized, but in this case, it's literally happening. You've got this potential nominee or potential candidate on the Republican side, but we've talked previously about Joe Walsh, former Tea Party congressman, flipped parties, became a Democrat last month, and is now eyeing a U.S. Senate bid as a Democrat. So
I actually just recently saw him addressing a Low Country crowd at the No Kings protests down there a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if he's the right person for South Carolina. He was given this speech, which was like very militant, trying to fire them up. I specifically remember the line, between now and midterms, you are going to do shit you never thought that you were going to do. And like you're looking at this crowd, and it was pretty much like Social
Geezers
Security
and-
recipient age people and a couple of, LGBTQIA, UIOP plus millennials. It was just not like
Not the pitchfork
not the
grabbers.
like Antifa, BLM, go throw a brick through a cop car crowd, but he was given that kind of speech. But the dude's not from here. He's carpetbagging.
Yeah.
And it showed, because that was not the speech that anybody who is engaged in South Carolina politics would have expected or given.
Walsh, though, does have a huge national following, and that national money, access to it, he could potentially also present an alternative to the other big Democrat in that race, Annie Andrews, who has demonstrated that she can't even win, in fact, can't even get within 10 percentage points of the most competitive congressional district. How's she going to win a statewide race, even against somebody as unpopular as Lindsey Graham? Because, Dylan, we've talked a lot about Lindsey Graham and his unpopularity. Let's say this for the man. He has consistently outperformed at the ballot box, particularly in general elections when there's no alternative for Republicans.
Yeah. I mean, look, if it comes down to it, every Republican would take Lindsey Graham over, say, Jamie Harrison, which was their last choice, the guy who then went on to chair the Democrat Party into a failure similarly spectacular to his own failure in 2020 and 2024. But Harrison, I think, compared to the people we just discussed, is a much more serious candidate in South Carolina. He's an African-American male who conducted himself with like an appropriate level of, political gravitas, that he was a serious candidate, and they spent $100 million making sure that people had that impression of him.
And he still lost by 10.
And he still got drummed. He didn't just
Lindsey
lose.
Graham.
He got drummed by, now granted, Trump was bringing people out of the woodworks to vote in that 2020 election. And I think a lot of people are just straight ticket voting Republican against him. I'll take all the Republican candidates. That helps Graham out a lot. His danger is not in the general election. If he makes it through the primary, he'll be our senator. And all these people are just running vanity projects and, seeing how much money they can piss away on the Democrat side.
Well, real quick before we go, we've talked a lot about the nationalization of these races and how South Carolina, then sort of things that happen here, ripple effects across the rest of the country. But we are seeing that already start up as it relates to the 2028 race. South Carolina, obviously the first in the nation for the Democrats, and then the pivotal first in the South primary for Republicans. But we are seeing a very big name on the Democrat side, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California in his second term. Been reelected twice and survived a recall election there in California, one of the most liberal politicians in America, but bringing his message to 8 rural South Carolina counties this coming week. 8th and 9th of July, he will be visiting 8 rural Palmetto State counties, 6 of which went for Donald Trump, including 2 of which that Trump won by 75% or higher. Now, Dylan, we talked a little bit about this in the run-up to the show, but I wanted to ask you this. This is obviously a politician with a message that's probably not going to sell in rural South Carolina, but let me flip that question for you a little bit. How hard would it be for Gavin Newsom to make the case to some of these Republican or just voters in these districts, in these counties, that the Republican rule here in South Carolina has not accrued to their benefit?
This has nothing to do with the general election, in my opinion. He is trying to appeal to the potential primary voters, because he's going to have an incredibly difficult time winning a Trump 75-25 district in a general election. That's not why he's there. He's there to get ahead of whatever candidate, the Jim Clyburn wing of the Democrat Party is going to get behind in 2028. He wants to take a clear and commanding lead as the Democrat candidate of choice in this state, and he's doing this across the country. We're not alone here, but specifically in visiting South Carolina, I think that's what he's targeting, is getting this early name recognition, getting this early support, so that he has a good chance of being the clear candidate of choice in 2028.
But is it easy though for let's just put any Democrat name on it? It doesn't have to be a famous guy like Gavin Newsom. Isn't it fairly easy to make the case in these counties that Republican rule here has not helped them?
I mean, sure, he can make the case, but who's going to be there listening to it?
Yeah, that's true. Well, we got a pseudo-socialist from California driving the narrative for Democrats. We've got an outright socialist up in New York driving the narrative for Democrats. Dylan, how hard does that make things for them as they try to, again, appeal to these voters that they lost in the last election cycle? Is it just an impossible lift?
It's interesting. I think as we get closer to the day of reckoning on the debt, history tells us that this is when economic populism of both the left and the right becomes more politically viable. We've, of course, seen this. I mean, look at Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump. That was a left-wing populist versus a right-wing populist. The Democrat Party rigged the primary to screw Bernie, so they kind of put off this day of reckoning on their side. However, the Republican Party has been living in this world now for 10 years. But clearly, we look to New York. We look to Gavin. I think Gavin's a complete. He's going to be whatever his pollsters tell him to be. So we don't really know what Gavin's going to look like, and that's why I want to attend one of these and see what the stump of the moment is now. I think it'll be radically different come election season. Whatever mood the nation is in is what he will be. He's an actor, and he's a damn good one. So take him seriously. But I think there is certainly a moment here where a lot of people, they're economically illiterate. They think socialism is a good idea. It's gonna be a massive movement here as times get tough for the little guy, as they inflate away the value of our money and nobody's getting raises to keep up with it. Everybody's going to be feeling that they're getting poorer. No, we're not going to default. They're just going to inflate their way, quote unquote, out of it. But it's going, I mean, we are potentially at the end of a long economic cycle, like a 70-year economic cycle, which could result in the United States no longer being the reserve currency of the world. And this is a process that will take a while to unfold, but it's going to be very economically painful. And I think it's going to, no, as I said, austerity is not popular. More free stuff is popular. It's easy. It's easy to sell. Even if it doesn't actually make sense when you put the pencil to the paper, it's easy to sell. I mean, look at the guy Mandami up in New York. He's talking about making state-run grocery stores, state-run housing. This is just pure socialism. And the Democrat Party is going to have a fork in the road where they decide, do we keep running the Hillary Clinton wing of the party? The Clinton wing, of course, being the Democrats found success, their first post-Reagan success, in basically just copying Republican policies and playing saxophone and smoking cigars with the ladies in the Oval Office.
No, I want to bring that. We're going to pull this picture up here. This is the last big beautiful bill that actually balanced the budget here, Dylan. We got Bill Clinton playing the sax here. That's the last big beautiful bill that balanced the budget. But I tell you what, Democrats here in South Carolina obviously irrelevant at the state level, but cannot snooze on that 2028 First of the Nation primary. It is what, if you go back,
that's why Gavin's coming here.
That's why he's coming here, but it's also why Biden won the nomination. Remember, Biden was dead until he came to South Carolina.
In those northeastern white states, he was getting hammered.
Crushed. His campaign was over. But Jim Clyburn, like you said a moment ago, that was what pulled him back into the race. The victory here propelled him to Super Tuesday, which propelled him to the nomination. The rest was history.
South Carolina gave America Sleepy Joe. Bless our hearts.
And the Orange Man. So, I'll tell you, it's the state that picks presidents. And Dylan, that's why we always say it here. Just because you are not tracking South Carolina politics and paying attention to what happens here doesn't mean that South Carolina politics aren't paying attention and driving narratives that are going to impact you. So once again, keep it tuned to FITSNews. We got some big plans for this show moving forward, folks, talking about a lot of different things as we expand our political coverage, as we look to the 2026 elections here, which are going to be pivotal in setting up those 2028 presidential primaries. For all the latest political news, we broke a ton of it this past week, but keep it tuned to FITSNews as we continue to track both those pivotal stories here in South Carolina and the ripple effects of them across America. All right, folks, that is a wrap for this week's edition of Your Week in Review. I want to thank everybody for taking time out on their holiday weekend to check out the show. We'll be back next week with another edition. We'll see you then.